Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to The Sounds of Film. And I'm very excited to have back on the show again Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert comic strip and one of the most successful comic strips of all time, I should add. He's also the best selling author of the influential book, How to Fail at Almost Anything and Still Win Big. He's a trained hypnotist and the host of Coffee with Scott Adams. His latest book is Reframe Your Brain, the User Interface for Happiness and Success. It's an incredible book. Scott, thank you so much for joining me on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I really do want to get into the book and some other issues, but really quickly before we do, I just wanted to mention that some of our listeners may have heard about your incident this past year that led to newspapers and book publishers canceling you. I want our listeners to know that Scott has been a guest on the program through the years a couple of times, and he's always been kind and helpful and entertaining. I've seen his explanation of the reported incident and believe that he didn't mean any harm. Um, I think some of you might want to go. He's been on a lot of podcasts recently and on YouTube. You can see his explanation, or if he wants to add anything, he can. Doesn't have to. But I wouldn't have Scott on if I didn't think, if I thought that he was not going to be saying things that you would approve of. I think he was making some observations about society and use some extreme hyperbole that unfortunately just sounds kind of terrible when taken out of context. But in these times, incidents like this can be used to take down influential people. The show has always been supportive of free speech, and I've had lots of controversial guests on through the years, and this audience has always been great. So I hope that you welcome Scott, um, listen to what he has to say about his book, Reframe Your Brain, and enjoy the show. Scott, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Well, just some context for some of your listeners who are maybe not media experts. One of the things you need to know is that all news about public figures is fake. It's either out of context or just made up. I'm no exception. In my case, there's a context that's missing that would change how you feel about everything. I don't know anybody who had any problem with what I said who listened to me explain it in context. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, and that's why I do encourage people to go. There's lots of examples online of you doing that. So, one thing I do want to note, and correct me if I'm wrong, when all of this stuff was going on with the cancellations, you were not canceled from YouTube or Twitter then. Um,
Right.
is that correct? Because
Yeah,
those were
yeah,
like the easiest things in the world to be canceled from, but you
yeah.
weren't from them.
No, yeah, yeah, and there's a reason why. Both of them have terms of service. So if there's a written term of service that says what you can and cannot do, I didn't come anywhere near violating any terms of service. But in the book business and the newspaper business, there's no terms of service. So they were just responding to customers complaining. And for them, it was just a business decision. I wouldn't even call it censorship or anything like that. It was just a flat business decision.
That's interesting. You said on your show at the end of the last presidential election that certain people associated with the right would be hunted down. There was a recent article in Newsweek, which you've mentioned, that exposes how intelligence agencies are considering labeling certain people as terrorists. Um, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have not heard about this story. Just very briefly, can you tell us what you've learned about this and what it might mean?
Yeah, I'm no expert on this topic, but my understanding is that the FBI is categorizing what they call the MAGA supporters as potentially dangerous people. So that would be an example of hunting. I would say that the January 6 people locked up who were not the violent ones. Of course, nobody supports the violent ones, but the ones who didn't do anything that was especially, let's say, different than other protests, that looks like they were targeted and hunted. And certainly online, you can see that the most let's say, the most effective voices that are associated with the right. And by the way, I'm a Democrat, so I get unfairly labeled quite a bit. I'm all over the board, but if you don't like what I said, then you think I'm on the other side. That's sort of how that works.
Yeah.
So so don't assume I'm on a side. Uh, that's been a mistake in the past.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are probably about five different ways in which Republicans are being singled out. There are the parents who complained at school board meetings, they were targeted. So in many different ways, people associated with the right who have ever said anything good about the right side of politics, they have been targeted. So I would call that hunted. One of my best predictions.
And how concerned are you about this?
Um, I think it's potentially lethal. We're sort of reaching a point where I've actually started talking to people about the likelihood of going to jail for not necessarily committing any crimes. But it doesn't take much for the Department of Justice to decide that you've committed a crime.
Wow. Um, Going back to the idea of cancellation, I looked at the end of your book, and you have a reframe, which is what your book is all about. At the end of your book, thanking all of the newspapers and publishing companies who canceled you. And you said something along the lines of that you didn't realize how much you missed your artistic freedom until you got it back. Uh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, one of the things that surprised people, and maybe it surprised me too, is that I never had a bad day after getting canceled. I was never angry. I was never sad, never depressed, never disappointed, never anything. I just sort of said, oh, this is a new situation. Let's see what I can do with this. And I realized that after I got canceled, that after that, I could just start a subscription service and be uncensored. So humor in 2023 is so different than humor in, let's say, the 50s or 60s when newspapers were a big thing. And the censorship level in newspapers, appropriately, because it's a family vehicle, they go to the lowest common denominator. So if you could imagine trying to make jokes that will not offend anybody under any situation, including children, it's pretty hard to. And it's one of the reasons there aren't many cartoonists because it's such a narrow channel. Not many people can navigate it. It's sort of like being uh, Seinfeld. He does clean stand up,
Yeah,
but the reason Seinfeld, in part because of his talent, of course, but there just aren't many people who can do that. Jim Gaffigan,
yeah,
he can do clean stand up. But why are those two so famous? It's not just because they're funny. It's because they can be funny in a way that the whole family can watch, and that's actually kind of unique. So coming out of that world, and now I run Dilbert. Has never stopped. It's been daily even after cancellation. But now it's running on the X platform. Used to be Twitter. Just hit the subscribe button in my profile, and also on the Locals platform, scottadams.locals.com, where I have other stuff in addition to Dilbert.
I love speaking to you about your show and your political ideas and all the reframe stuff. But I always have to be reminded. You mentioned Dilbert. You are. Can you just explain to our listeners who maybe just don't know this? You are one of the most successful, um, comic book, not comic book, but comic strip creators in history. I mean, Charles Schultz level. Um, it's just quite amazing, and it's funny
Well,
that's really not what people are even talking to you about anymore. I mean,
yeah.
we should really just be talking about Dilbert, but there's so much else that we want to talk about today. But can you just speak to like the high achievement levels that you attained with Dilbert?
Well, let me put it in perspective. Nobody's going to come close to Peanuts because that was a different time. Newspapers ruled the world, and Peanuts was it. I'll just give you an anecdote from that. Charles Schultz, in the last, I don't know, few years before he died, he called me on some business, some charity he was working on, and we got chatting. And one of the things he mentioned to me is that he had recently passed the 1 billion mark of greeting cards sold.
Oh my
1
goodness.
billion. Now, now I was trying to think, is there any form of entertainment anywhere who has ever sold 1 billion of anything?
Wow.
I, I, I cheekily asked him if he knew his net worth, and he just laughed and said no. But so that's a different level. You know, Dilbert did great within the business world. It's the most famous thing. And you could argue that of cartoons that were, let's say, targeted for adults, you could argue whether Peanuts is that or not. But for the ones that are targeted toward adults in the workplace, nothing's been like it. So it was a phenomenon for decades.
And like we said a second ago, you are happy now to have your artistic freedom. Um, but it is a little sad from I don't know from my point of view anyhow. I can't say how you feel, but it is kind of sad that it's not in the newspaper. I know no one's really reading newspapers anymore and like they
Right.
used to, but um, it's just amazing what happened.
Yeah. Just so nobody feels bad for me, it happened in the same year that right after I turned 65, and I was looking desperately for a way to retire.
Yeah,
But the problem with cartooning at the time, just the situation I was in, is that it paid so well that it just didn't make sense to stop doing it. But man, did I want to stop doing it. Now, when I moved it to subscription, I'm still doing the same amount of work. But as soon as I could do a comic about anything I wanted, it turned into fun.
yeah,
So all of the work went away and it turned into fun. And now the subscriptions are growing every day, where newspapers were shrinking every day. So I managed to move from a stale old platform that was doing nothing but slowly decaying onto something that could grow infinitely. And I had all of my rights back too. I got all of my rights for the comics
wow,
as well as my recent books, which I republished. And for a creative person, getting all of your rights back is
it's
first of all
incredible.
almost unheard of. I
Yeah,
mean, it's beyond just the best thing that could ever happen to a creative person. And then I got on something that's growing instead of shrinking and not embarrassing me, because being part of the newspaper industry was frankly embarrassing. I was my comic ran in the Washington Post. The Washington Post, this may not be obvious to people who don't follow media, is not even close to a credible organization anymore. There's so much fake news and government propaganda that comes through that I can't believe I was ever associated with it or I ever took their money. It was embarrassing. But I think they led the charge to get me canceled. I was a big critic of theirs for years. And when people watch this story, if they think it's about a cartoonist said something, that they're missing the entire context that I've been primarily a political figure for the last, I don't know, 7 years.
yeah,
And I have to say this, it sounds like bragging, but it's the only way you can understand the topic. I'm probably in the top 20 of influential political voices. And it's not because I have the biggest platform, it's because of who follows me and because I reframe a lot of topics. And if you can learn to reframe things, in other words, make somebody think of it in a different way, and that's based on my training as a hypnotist, you can have a really oversized impact, which I can observe that I do have. And I'm one of the people that's just being taken off the chessboard. So as we approach the 2024 season, there's a list of, I don't know, half a dozen of the best communicators have been taken off the board. And it's not a coincidence.
yeah. And by the way, that book is called "Reframe Your Brain: The User Interface for Happiness and Success." And it seems like you're reframing every second. One of the things I like about your show is that you take current events and you put your own spin on it, and you get people to look at things differently. I think a lot of times more accurately and truthfully. Um, just a couple of things before we get into that. You recently said on your show that you're almost off of Prisoner's Island. Um, can you explain to our listeners what that means?
Yeah. So I have let's say a life strategy that I recommend to all of you. which is you should have a story of your life, not a story of the events in your life, but a story that sort of signifies your life, as if you were once in a movie. So the story that I use is Prisoner Island, and it goes like this. For whatever reason, I'm dropped on Prisoner Island where there's nobody there but prisoners. On day one, they beat me up and do terrible things to me and leave me for dead. On day two, same thing. They beat me to within an inch of my life and do terrible things and leave me for dead. But if you come back in a year, my promise is that I will be the king of Prisoner Island and everybody who touched me will be dead. Now, that doesn't mean anything like that's ever going to happen. But when bad things happen, just in the course of life, everybody has some bad times. When I find myself on Prisoner Island, I never think, oh, this is terrible. This is the end of me. Woe is me. I always think, you guys are in so much trouble. You don't know. and and forget about whether it's true or it's an accurate picture of who you are or any of that. It's not about that. It's about a story you tell yourself that becomes your operating system, so that when you get in a jam, you don't have to think it through. Every time I end up on Prisoner Island, and let's say getting canceled worldwide would be an example of that, but not the only one. I mean, I've been on Prisoner Island quite a few times, and every time I'm there, I'm like, ah, it's familiar.
Yeah.
You have no idea how many times I've been on Prisoner Island, so you have no idea what's coming, but I do, and I'm going to get off of Prisoner Island after I'm the king.
I like that. This show is called The Sounds of Film, and kind of similar to what you were just talking about. You often will bring up the idea that life is sometimes maybe like a movie script. Sometimes you tie it into the simulation theory, um, but in recent times you've talked a little bit. You've kind of thrown out a hint as to maybe there's a chance that Donald Trump will have a third act or or something of those. I mean, it seems impossible, but
Yeah,
I think that's the whole idea of the third act, right?
yeah. I suppose a lot of your listeners know what a three-act movie looks like. So just a review. The third act is where your hero of the movie is in so much trouble that the audience can't even imagine how they would get out of this fix. And then, of course, that's what makes it a movie that they do. Now, I've noted, as you mentioned, that the real world conforms to that three-act movie in far more times than you think would make any sense. And there's no causation that I can think of unless the world is just so used to a three-act movie that we sort of unintentionally nudge things in that direction, which I suspect is possible. But let's take the Trump case. His his first act is, he runs for president and everybody thinks he's a clown. His second act is he unexpectedly becomes president and then, does a bunch of stuff. So that's your second act is your hero does a bunch of stuff. They're in the groove, they're fighting back, they're doing whatever they're doing. But then his third act was losing the election, but on top of that, that wouldn't be fatal. But on top of that, blamed for being traitorous over January 6th, impeached, indicted. There's 91 counts against him. There could not be more third act things happening to one person, just perfectly, scripted third act things. So I have speculated, and I want you to know that this is only based on the weird observation that life seems to prefer a third act form. And the prediction is the most unexpected, most theatrical, most movie like ending would be the least expected, most outrageous thing. And it would be proof that the election was rigged. Now, I'm not going to be an idiot and predict that it's going to happen because that just makes you look like a fool. But, and I'm not aware of any evidence that would meet the standard of that. However, I am aware of a number of things brewing that, at least on the surface, of course, we've been fooled a million times about claims that didn't pan out, but there is some chance it could actually happen. There's a non-zero chance that'll happen before election day, and that would just be the most amazing third act of all time.
That would be absolutely insane. I should point out that I'm very aware that there's listeners out there who do not like Donald Trump, and this sounds horrifying to them. Not everyone, though, is listening. We have a mixed audience.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Let me just put in there. I'm endorsing Vivek Ramaswamy. I think
okay.
we need to go younger. So I don't dislike Trump, but he does have a lot of baggage,
It,
and I'm not ignoring that.
did you say that you at one point did something with the Al Gore campaign a long time ago?
No, not with the campaign. I just met him in the White House. Turns out he was a Dilbert fan.
Oh, okay.
I was in the White House just doing a tour, and I guess somebody told him I was in the White House, and he tracked me down. So we chatted. I actually helped him, not with the campaign. I helped him. He asked me to help him with some communications about things he was accomplishing as vice president, re-engineering the government. And I told him that I couldn't do that because half of the country would stop reading Dilbert if anybody found out I was working with
Wow.
him. So instead, I set him up with somebody who was better at that, and I think they actually helped him out.
Wow. We're speaking with Scott Adams, and his latest book is Reframe Your Brain, the User Interface for Happiness and Success. It's a very, very informative book, and it's a lot of fun to read. One more thing, the sounds of film, we talk a lot about movies. We also play a lot of music. And I have to ask you, music has come up a lot through the years on your show, and like some of the things that you've talked about is that there's this album that one can listen to. It's I think it's still streaming that features your voice. Someone used your voice from different, I guess maybe even episodes of the show, and edited it to instrumental music. I've heard you talking about learning how to play the drums. And I've even heard you, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, make some kind of claim that, like, if you wanted to, like, you could write the perfect song, like a hit song, like, the secret to doing it. And
Yeah.
can you just tell me a little bit about music, and why you bring it up on occasion?
Music and me. Well, I am learning to play drums. A lot of that is my strategy for my senior years, trying to challenge myself, physically and mentally in ways that are different than I usually challenge myself. So that has more to do with, just an interest and stuff. I also talk about music being a drug
Yeah, I
that
was going to
that
ask you
is
about that
just
too.
administered through your ears. And if music had never existed, and some startup came up with it and said, hey, if you put this stuff in your ears, it's going to make you feel a certain way, happy or whatever. It would actually be regulated by the FDA.
Hmm.
It's just that it's always been around, so we don't think to do that. But I use music medicinally, meaning that if I want to work out, it helps. But if I want to concentrate, it hurts. And if I want to control my own thoughts and feelings, it's a really bad idea because the songs are trying to, yank you around. Feel this, feel that. Now the next song, feel this. So it's kind of a journey that I prefer not to take. So I'm not a consumer of music just because it sounds good. I like to pair it with something. I'm either listening for the drums so I can learn to play them, or trying to get charged up to do some exercise. Well, there was a third thing you mentioned about music. What was
Yeah,
the other?
I thought you had made a claim one time that
Oh,
you figured
yes.
out like how
I
to write like the catchiest perfect song or something like that.
Yeah, I should put some context around that. I'm somewhat famous, at least among my small group of followers, for doing things successfully outside of my field. Predictions and
Right.
politics and stuff like that. So it's sort of a thing that I do things outside of my field.
Yeah.
But the specific reason that I think I could write a hit song is because I'm a hypnotist. And at least in terms of the lyrics, I'm pretty sure I could write lyrics that would blow your mind.
Hmm.
The same way I could if I were writing, a book or a tweet or something. I mean, I have 1 million followers on the X platform because they like my thoughts in short form. And music is sort of short form in a way. There's not a whole lot of content in the song. So it did seem to me that I could arrange some words or create a hook that would be amazing. The hard part would be, putting it to music. I think I would be less capable of doing that, quite a bit less. But if somebody actually was good with the music part, I think I could write the lyrics to a hit song.
Wow. Uh, you mentioned how music can be used sort of as a drug, and that it's in some ways dangerous. You've said similar things about movies as well. That both music and movies can alter your mood, your can make you feel a certain way, and it seems like you feel that's dangerous in a way. Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, I'm not sure danger is the right word because 100% of our culture is trying to program us. Movies would be a strong version, but everybody's marketing to you and selling you stuff, and the news is crazy, and so you live in a world in which everything's coming at you. Movies would be one of them. Now you're probably aware that I don't know what years it was, but when the CIA was working with Hollywood to make sure that the movies were appropriately patriotic
Mm,
and they could make sure that young men would say, I like the look of that war movie. I wish I could do some of that and join the military. So we know that movies do work as propaganda. Nazi Germany proved that with their movies, etc.
yeah.
But you don't always know what's happening. There's some that are heavy-handed, and you say, I think I know what's happening there. But others are different. For example, um, in my opinion, the entire genre of sci-fi has been ruined by the effort to force wokeness into the characters and the stories. You can't even watch a series, a sci-fi series, where there isn't at least one alien who's doing something like being a transitioning to something else. So they always try to work, a very narrow set of political interests into the episodes. Now, I would say that that's, partly they're trying to be diverse, and that's a good instinct. Partly they're trying to include everybody. I like that. That those are all good instincts. But if you put too much burden on a script and too much burden on the casting, you reduce your options, and it becomes really obvious to the viewer that you didn't have tools to work with. You were sort of constrained there. So I do think that in terms of, let's call it wokeness, you could put a more positive word on it. I generally am in favor of, by the way, um, almost all of the wokeness, except when it gets to kids and crazy stuff. So I am more Democrat than maybe it seems like if you follow me on X, but I do think it kills art because it's an extra burden on top of the art.
Interesting. One of the things that you do on your show, as I mentioned earlier, is that you reframe the news. Just like movies and music may be trying to influence you, the news, the mainstream news, obviously is. I guess all different kinds of news platforms are to some extent. But your specialty is you're able to take a look at the news and you tell us what's really going on. For our listeners that don't watch your program, can you explain a little bit what your purpose is on the show?
Well, my I have this philosophy that I heard long ago from some business expert who said that you don't tell your customers what you're selling; they tell you.
Mm,
Meaning you can make a first try, but as soon as you've done your first try, your customers are going to say, "Hey, you thought you were selling this, but I used it for paperweight or something." Now, in my case, I just started doing live streaming because I just thought, hey, what's this Periscope app on Twitter years ago? And I just held it up and pushed the button and I was live to the world. And then I just started talking about whatever I felt like. So it started out as shapeless and formless and had no intention. But apparently I said some things that people liked, and they would say, I really liked it when you did that one thing. Do more of that. And so it ended up being about politics and headlines and persuasion in particular, because that's the one filter I can put on things that most people can't, which is I can see persuasion almost like an open toolbox. Whereas if you were not trained in that, you wouldn't even see the toolbox, much less see it open. So that was the reason that I predicted back in 2015, which is amazing if you think about it, that Trump would become president when literally no one except maybe Ann Coulter thought that was possible. And it was only because I saw his toolbox. I saw how persuasive he was because of the tools he was using. Now, I use that in a number of ways. For example, Do you remember when there was a story that said there was a secret sonic weapon that had been aimed at embassies and it was scrambling our ambassadors' minds? Do you remember that story?
I do.
Yeah. On day one, I said that is a fake story, and all of the people who are also experiencing it in other embassies are part of a mass hysteria. Now, as time would go by, the news would say, oh, it was definitely a weapon. We're looking for that weapon. And more stories would confirm it, and more stories could confirm it. And every time I saw those, I would say, nope, mass hysteria. There is no weapon. Well, finally, the news caught up with me and said, we don't know what was happening, but there doesn't seem to be any weapon involved. There is real damage, but my guess is that if you looked at enough brains, you would find abnormalities in a lot of them anyway. So it might be that. But that was a classic case of a mass hysteria,
Hmm.
which I could spot at inception, which most people couldn't. And it's only because I've studied mass hysterias. So as soon as I heard the other embassies were reporting the same problems, I mean, that was a tell. I go, mass hysteria. Because there's lots of historical examples of just that sort of thing. So if you know what a mass hysteria is, you know how cognitive dissonance works, you know how confirmation bias works, and you have a little bit of knowledge about the propaganda, uh, let's say, nature of television and the news, then you could just spot things that other people don't know. I mean, I don't know if people realize that the news isn't real. Now, and when I say that, I know that your listeners are saying some form of this. Ha ha ha. Yes, I know Fox News is not real. No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Fox News and all the rest give you a form of news that fits their audience, but the actual reality is often different from what's reported. Not that they're necessarily lying intentionally. That doesn't happen a lot. It's more like what they leave out, what context they leave in, what guests they have on. It paints completely different and in some cases completely misleading pictures. So the news is not news anymore. It's a form of propaganda.
It's funny. Yesterday I was talking to the filmmakers of this new documentary that's coming out on HBO about Y2K, and as you were talking about mass hysteria, I was wondering. I've never really heard you talk about Y2K. That was prior to your show. I don't know if you've brought it up on episodes where I haven't seen it, but I'm kind of curious what you were thinking at that time about when the whole Y2K thing was going on.
Well, that gets to something I've been calling for years, the Adams law of slow-moving disasters.
Hmm.
And the way that works is that humans are extraordinary. We have like 100%, unbroken record, at least in modern times, of seeing some big problem coming at us and then remediating it. So when the Y2K problem came up, first of all, there are two interesting stories about this. One is that court cases used the Dilbert comic to make the case that managers should have been aware of it and planned for it because it was so well known by that point. There was a content of a Dilbert comic in every newspaper. And so that was actually part of court cases.
Wow.
But early on, I was predicting that we would take care of it, even when almost everybody said we couldn't, that it was impossible. And my prediction was that as we got closer to the deadline, our creativity and energy would just meet the moment. And what happened was programmers figured out how to automate the process of fixing it. Now, we didn't see that coming, but we kind of should have. I mean, it is, after all, software. Somebody was going to figure out an automated way to look for the problems and correct them, and then they did. So when absolutely nothing happened, when the year changed after Y2K, um, I was vindicated because I don't know if anybody else was predicting we would be fine.
Wow. We're speaking again with Scott Adams. He's the author of Reframe Your Brain, the user interface for happiness and success. Um, One of the things that's kind of cool about this book is that you go in depth into different ways in which you can reframe things in your life to get to improved positions in life, to be happy, and so forth. And then at the end, you just have like a simple relisting of just the main ideas that's very handy. Are there any parts of the book in particular that you like to talk to audiences about that you feel like might interest them and make them want to
Yeah,
read the book?
at this point, yeah, the reframes go from, work to social life to your mental health to your physical health. But at this point, I know which ones people mentioned to me, that changed their life. And so one of them is, I say it's not, your job is not your job description. Your job is not what your boss tells you is your job.
Mm,
That's what you have to do for money. But your job is to get a better job.
yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it's the first day of work at your new job, you should be looking for a better job. And that's more of a mindset reframe kind of thing, because it's easy to settle in and say, all right, I just got a new job, so let me focus on this new job. I learned this from a CEO once. I ended up sitting on an airplane when I was 21, and he explained to me that he became a CEO because every time he got a job, he started looking for a better job, and he just never stopped. And he would just do interviews and interviews and interviews, and soon he'd get a better job, and he just, next thing you know, he was a CEO. So that's a good one. People say a number of people have contacted me and said, I can't believe I already got a new job. Like a week after reading the book, they're like, why don't I think like that? And sure enough, it works. The one that blows me away is the simple reframe, alcohol is poison.
Yeah.
And this highlights a key thing about reframes. They can make sense, and it's probably better if they do, but it's not necessary. They can simply work as an irrational force in your brain, like a software patch that doesn't have to mean anything. It's just the patch. So when I said a lot of times in public that that's how I think of it, alcohol is poison. I've never had a drinking problem, but I wanted to stop drinking entirely, and that reframe just instantly stopped. I never had another drink, and it was because I had been thinking of alcohol as a beverage. If you think of it as a beverage, now this is pure hypnosis, by the way. If you think of it as a beverage, you automatically take everything that comes with beverage, which is it's an option.
Hmm.
Yeah, I could have a beverage. I'm thirsty. I'll have a beverage. But the moment you say it's poison, it removes all your options. Oh, well, doesn't matter how thirsty I am. Doesn't matter how awkward I am at the party. Why would I drink poison? That's crazy. Now, even though your brain knows what is and isn't poison, and this doesn't quite fit the definition exactly, although a little bit, just the pairing of the words, alcohol and poison, um, probably a few people per week for a long time now have been saying, you know what, I just stopped drinking entirely from that one sentence, alcohol is poison.
Wow, that's
So
amazing.
that's another. Want to hear another one?
Yeah, and I have one I want to ask you about too that has been something that I've heard you say and that I can
Ask yours. Ask yours first.
yeah. Oh, mine? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to do something is the way people often will state things like they have a goal or something like that. And you said that you should reframe it. uh, I have decided to do something, and
I
that makes all
is
the difference.
right.
And in
Is
hindsight, I can
wanting,
look back and
wanting
see how
is
that's
deciding.
powerful.
Yeah. So when you want something, you're open to both the benefits of it, but you're also considering the cost. And you say to yourself, man, I'd sure want to do that, but wow, I'd have to go back to school. I'd have to move, I'd have to get rid of my cat, whatever it is. And and then you say, I don't want it that much. And I found that there's a big difference between wanting what I just described and deciding. Once you decide, the costs don't matter anymore. Now, they do matter in the sense you're still going to pay them, but they're not part of the decision process. I'll give you an example. I wanted to upgrade my live streaming equipment with a piece of software that would allow me to stream to multiple places. I tried this several times before because it was something I wanted to do. And every time I would get frustrated because I couldn't figure out something or it gave me a bug, and I'd be like, I don't want it that much, and I'd stop. But recently, I got demonetized by YouTube on several of my live streams, and they didn't seem to have any pattern. It just looked like I was being targeted. And remember, people like me are being targeted. It's not our imagination. The Twitter files prove that, for example, and YouTube, it's kind of obvious. And so once I realized that I had to diversify and I had to be on other platforms because YouTube is likely to just turn off my entire income just with one button, Uh, as soon as I decided, I went through exactly the same process, got the software, worked through it, and there would be one problem after another that I had to solve. And not once was it difficult or unpleasant, but it was really difficult and unpleasant when I just wanted it to work. Because I was like, oh, why do I have to do this? Oh, my password didn't work. No, I've got to figure that out. But as soon as I had to do it, because I decided nothing's going to stop me, I just pushed through it and I was done in like 2 days. It was just nothing. And you'll find that over and over again, that the difference between deciding, in which there is no obstacle that will stop you, and wanting is night and day.
Wow. And what was the one that you were going to bring up? Because I think we have time for one more.
This is my favorite one. It's called the respawn. You imagine we're often burdened by guilt or things in the past or just terrible things from our past, trauma, everything. But the reframe goes like this. If you were a video game and you just respawned and you woke up and you looked around and said, all right, the past doesn't matter because I was just born into this life as an adult. What are my assets? And I look around and I go, okay, I got a job. Good. I seem to be healthy. All right, excellent. I look in the mirror. I'm like, not so good looking, but nobody's going to run away. That's okay. I can work with that. And I look at what I have, my relationships, etc. And I go, you know what? This isn't bad at all. And it's one way to forget your traumas and your burdens. Just imagine you just respawned and nothing ever mattered in the past, because in some ways it doesn't. The past is imaginary, but we don't allow it to be imaginary because our mind blends the past and the future and the present. But if you play it like a game, it brings you into a mental model where you can say, yeah, I just popped into existence, what am I going to do now? And it puts you in a whole different mindset.
What do you mean our past is not? How did you phrase it? The past
Oh,
is.
well, history is imaginary.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
I mean, you can't take a handful of history. You can't, nail it to a wall. It's just a pattern of things in your brain at this point, where it might be a pattern of zeros and ones on some video or file somewhere, but it doesn't exist at the moment. In the same way that the future doesn't exist, it exists as a concept, but it doesn't exist. And once you allow that your moment, where you are at this moment is the only thing that you can deal with that's real. It really helps um, your anxiety, I would say, in particular, and even depression maybe, because you can just say, that other stuff, it's purely imaginary. I still have a memory of it, but it wasn't real. It was like a movie I remember.
Hmm. Yeah, I noticed that for a lot of these and things that you've even talked about on your show, like you'll say things along the lines of that, like facts don't matter, the past doesn't really matter. It all that matters is the message that's going into your brain, more or less. I don't know if I'm probably screwing it up, but I think that's hard for a lot of people to understand. And I know we only have a minute, but can you explain just really quickly?
Yeah, one of the things that hypnotists learn that's opposite of normal people. Normal people believe that humans are rational, let's say 90% of the time. But 10% of the time we'll get all worked up and we'll be irrational. Hypnotists learn its opposite, that we are irrational 90% of the time. In our choices of profession and mates and where we live and the house we buy, all the big stuff is irrational. And then we immediately rationalize it. So yeah, the process would be, all right, I'm definitely going to get that car, some part of your brain says, and then your rational brain gets in after the fact. So the decision's already made. And then your rational brain says, yep, it's the right price. Yep, that's the right color. Yep, it's available. And it just goes down the checklist. But we're basically irrational creatures. So the quote that you gave, which is facts don't matter, that applies to persuasion. Facts, of course, matter to life and death, right? If somebody shoots at you, it's a real bullet and it's really going to kill you. But if you're trying to persuade somebody, just as I said, alcohol is poison, well, that's not really a fact, but it made a whole bunch of people stop drinking forever. So
Hmm.
facts don't matter to your outcomes, except for very narrow situations.
This is fascinating stuff. And if this interests you, I highly recommend that you check out Scott's book, Reframe Your Brain, the User Interface for Happiness and Success. And I do believe this book is available currently on Amazon. Is that correct?
It is, yes. It's independently published because I got all canceled everywhere, but you can buy it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and probably a few other places, but try Amazon first.
Scott, I know you're a very busy person, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to come on the Sounds of Film. And once again, I want to recommend to our listeners Reframe Your Brain, the user interface for happiness and success. And not that you need my best wishes, but best of luck with the book. I know it's doing very well right now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for having me on. I always enjoy it.
Okay, thanks again. Bye bye.
Bye bye.